There is a darker truth about human behavior that almost no one is prepared to face. A psychopath doesn't reveal himself through his words, his charm, or the image he so carefully constructs. He reveals himself in the tiny cracks of his performance, micro-gestures so subtle most people never notice them. But Machiavelli, centuries before psychology ever existed, understood this instinctively. He knew that danger is never loud, never obvious, never theatrical. It hides in the details, in the fluctuations of the face, in the flashes of emotion that appear and disappear before the conscious mind catches them. He would say that the true threat is not the enemy who announces hostility, but the friend whose expression betrays an intention he tries to conceal. A brief tightening of the jaw when you speak a truth, the glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes at your misfortune, the almost invisible delay before he mirrors your smile. These are the signs that reveal more than any confession ever will. Most people trust words. Machiavelli trusted the face. Most people trust tone. Machiavelli trusted the twitch beneath it. And in a world where predators have learned to imitate empathy with perfect fluency, only those who watch the micro-movements, the slips of the masks, have any chance of recognizing who stands in front of them. Because evil has evolved. It no longer announces itself. It imitates humanity. It blends in. It hides behind charm, intelligence, kindness. But the body always betrays what the mind tries to hide. And Machiavelli knew the most dangerous person is the one who pretends to be harmless, yet cannot fully control the truth leaking from his own face. Machiavelli understood a principle that modern psychology would only formalize centuries later. All power begins with observation. The person who sees clearly holds the advantage over the person who merely speaks convincingly. If Machiavelli were alive today, he wouldn't waste time analyzing speeches, promises, or moral declarations. He would look at what the body reveals in the spaces between words. He would know instantly that psychopaths cannot be identified by what they say, because their speech is curated, rehearsed, and strategically designed to disarm. Their words are weapons, not windows. Their gestures, however, tell a different story, one they cannot fully control. Modern psychology calls this behavioral dissonance, the subtle mismatch between what someone wants you to believe and what their body involuntarily communicates. It is the split-second tightening around the eyes when they pretend to feel empathy. It is the stiffness of a smile that doesn't reach the muscles around the temples. It is the predatory stillness that appears when they think no one is watching. Machiavelli would see these fractures immediately, not because he had mystical intuition, but because he understood human nature at its core. Deception requires effort, but truth leaks effortlessly. A psychopath's intentions always surface in micro-expressions, those flickers of hostility, excitement, or contempt that erupt before they can be suppressed. These tiny betrayals, almost invisible to the untrained eye, are the cracks in the mask that reveal the predator long before he acts. Machiavelli would argue that these gestures are far more honest than any confession. Words can be sculpted, the body cannot. And the moment you learn to read these involuntary cues, you stop being a target and start becoming the one who sees through the performance. People fail to detect psychopaths for a simple but devastating reason. They listen to words instead of watching the body. They assume honesty lives in language, when in truth, language is the easiest tool to manipulate. Psychopaths know this intuitively. They rehearse their charm, they refine their tone, they craft narratives that evoke sympathy or admiration. Their speech is a costume performance built to seduce, distract, and disarm. But the body, even in the most disciplined deceiver, remains imperfectly trained. Micro-tensions slip through, a flash of irritation when contradicted, a micro-smirk during someone's pain, a momentary predatory stillness when assessing vulnerability. These are the tiny fractures that betray the truth behind the mask. Machiavelli would see the error instantly. He never believed power depended on eloquence. He knew it depended on perception. He who wishes to deceive, he would say, focuses on the tongue. But he who wishes to understand must focus on the eyes. The eyes, after all, reveal what the mouth tries to hide. They contract in contempt before a polite smile appears. They widen in predatory curiosity before a compassionate expression is mimicked. They fail to synchronize with the fabricated emotion being performed. And yet most people overlook these cues because they are enchanted by the surface. The charming voice, the confident speech, the well-timed laughter. This is why the tension between what the psychopath says and what the psychopath is never gets noticed. People judge intentions through narrative rather than physiology. They assume coherence where there is manipulation. They trust the persona instead of the pattern. Machiavelli would call this the first and most fatal mistake of the naive. Speech can be polished endlessly, but instinct cannot be fully disguised. And the psychopath's instinct dominance control. Predation always leaks through the body, in microseconds of unguarded truth. There comes a moment, subtle, irreversible, when your perception crosses a threshold. You start noticing the gestures other people overlook, the micro-threats embedded inside ordinary interactions. A half-second tightening of the lips when someone envies you, a sudden stillness when you reveal a vulnerability, a flicker of predatory delight when someone else is humiliated. Once you see these things, you cannot return to the innocence of listening only 2 words. It is as though your vision sharpens, your instincts awaken, and you step out of the collective fog that most people mistake for reality. This shift feels like entering an entirely different class of observers, a silent elite who perceive the game instead of being moved by it. The world doesn't change, you do. What once looked like friendly behavior begins to reveal underlying agendas. Smiles separate into 2 categories, the human and the rehearsed. Compliments divide into sincere and strategic. Touch becomes either bonding or territorial. You start distinguishing warmth from seduction, confidence from dominance, empathy from imitation. This is the point of no return. In this awakened state, the psychopath ceases to be a mysterious figure. He becomes predictably, almost mechanical. The charm feels pre-programmed. The emotional reactions arrive half a second too late. The imitation of empathy becomes a recognizable script. You begin to sense the void behind the eyes, the cold calculation behind the friendliness, the hunger behind the attention. He becomes, in a way, a glitch in the Machiavellian matrix, a presence whose polished mask no longer aligns with the micro-signals leaking beneath it. With this awareness, the psychopath's strategies lose their power. You see the predatory scanning behind his pauses. You notice the subtle dominance displays masked as politeness. You catch the micro-expressions of contempt before the charming smile returns. And each time you witness these reveals, your perception sharpens further. You stop being the target and become the observer. The person the psychopath instinctively avoids because he senses, perhaps without knowing why, that you are not fooled. This is the transformation Machiavelli understood well. Once you perceive the hidden mechanics of human nature, you rise above the surface theater, and from that vantage point, the predators of the social world stop being hunters and start being exposed patterns, visible, decipherable, and ultimately powerless. There is a silent cost to heightened perception, a kind of psychological tax that few people discuss because few people ever reach this level of awareness. The more you see, the more impossible it becomes to unsee. What once passed as ordinary human behavior now reveals layers of intention, strategy, and predation. A smile that once seemed friendly now appears hollow, its muscles activated in the wrong sequence, its warmth simulated rather than felt. A touch that once felt affectionate now carries a calculation, a subtle test of boundaries, a claim of territory disguised as connection. A posture that once seemed confident now reveals itself as an assertion of dominance, an attempt to take psychological space rather than simply occupy physical space. And an eye that once seemed attentive now scans like an instrument, measuring your weaknesses, not your humanity. This new vision doesn't turn you paranoid, it turns you perceptive. But that perception brings a strange kind of loneliness. You begin to realize that many interactions are not genuine exchanges, but performances, some harmless, others predatory. You notice the microdelays in emotional expression, the mismatched timing between facial muscles, the coldness behind polite gestures. You recognize when someone laughs, not because they find something funny, but because they want you to feel safe. You sense when someone listens, not out of interest, but out of strategic curiosity. And once you see these things, socializing changes. Rooms feel different. Conversations feel different. It begins to feel as though you walking through a landscape of unmasked predators, some fully aware of their nature, others simply driven by impulses they don't understand. You catch glimpses of hunger behind friendliness, manipulation behind empathy, competition behind kindness. The world becomes a theater where the scripts are outdated, but the actors still cling to them with desperate precision. This awareness brings with it a subtle ache, a sense of standing apart. You can no longer relax into the illusions that others find comforting. You can no longer pretend that every smile is sincere or that every gesture is benign. It becomes clear that much of what passes for normal human interaction is a negotiation of power, safety, and leverage. And though this vision protects you, it also isolates you. Because while others navigate the world asleep, trusting masks and words, you find yourself navigating among unveiled intentions, sensing the quiet predation beneath the surface. It is not that the world became darker. It is that your vision became sharper. And the sharper it becomes, the heavier the truth feels. You don't withdraw because you're fragile or antisocial. You withdraw because your nervous system can no longer tolerate the subtle distortions, the emotional traps, the energetic pressure that certain people create without ever raising their voice. Your body recognizes the threat long before your mind forms the sentence. It tightens, it contracts, it warns you. And once you learn to read the gestures that betray manipulation, the delayed smile, the predatory stillness, the touch that claims instead of connects you, stop forcing yourself to stay in rooms where your instincts are screaming to leave. What looks like avoidance from the outside is, on the inside, self-preservation in its purest form. Machiavelli understood this long before psychology labeled it intuition or boundary setting. He knew that wisdom is not measured by how many battles you fight, but by which dangers you refuse to stand near. The wise man, he would say, does not withdraw from the weak, but from the false. And you begin to feel this truth in your bones. You realize that every minute spent near someone who manipulates, flatters, imitates affection, or subtly undermines your sense of self is a minute taken from your clarity and stability. So you step back, not dramatically, not angrily, but decisively, not because you're afraid of them, but because you're finally loyal to yourself. Most people remain blind to these micro-signals because they cling to a comforting belief that everyone is fundamentally good, that warmth always means sincerity, that empathy is universal. This collective innocence becomes a kind of psychological fog, blurring the outlines of predatory behavior. In this fog, the psychopath moves effortlessly. He performs empathy with mechanical precision, copying emotional cues the way an actor memorizes lines. He imitates humanity the way a predator imitates stillness before striking strategically, not authentically. And because society prefers the illusion of universal goodness to the discomfort of discernment, it rewards this performance. People applaud the charming mask, the confident posture, the attentive gaze, never realizing that these behaviors are often rehearsed with surgical skill. They confuse mimicry for depth. They trust the performance instead of questioning why it feels slightly out of rhythm. Machiavelli understood this dynamic with terrifying clarity. He warned that anything performed too perfectly, too smoothly, too deliberately, usually reveals the opposite of what it aims to portray. Excessive sweetness conceals ambition. Excessive charm conceals calculation. Excessive agreement conceals strategy. And in the case of the psychopath, excessive empathy is often the clearest sign that no empathy exists at all. This is the tragedy of the collective shadow. People project goodness onto those who only imitate it, while failing to see the darkness behind gestures that are too polished, too timed, too flawless. What society calls kindness is often choreography. What society calls charisma is often camouflage. And as long as the collective prefers illusion over awareness, the psychopath remains hidden in plain sight, not because he is clever, but because the world refuses to look. Once you learn to read Machiavellian gestures, the subtle dominance moves, the calculated micro-expressions, the manufactured warmth, something fundamental shifts in the way you relate to people. Social performances that once felt normal now feel unbearably artificial. You begin to sense, with almost physical clarity, the difference between someone who is expressing themselves and someone who is acting a role. And nowhere does this become more obvious than in the psychopath's persona. His social mask, once convincing to you, now appears flimsy and over-rehearsed. The timing of his smiles feels engineered. His displays of concern appear choreographed. His compliments carry the metallic taste of strategy rather than sincerity. The more fluent you become in this silent language, the more impossible it becomes to tolerate falseness. The persona, the ideal self people try to project to gain approval, loses its power over you. You no longer respond to charm, charisma, or perfectly crafted emotional performances. You respond to alignment. Does the gesture match the intention? Does the expression follow the emotion? Does the energy feel congruent or manufactured? With this awareness, the psychopath's entire performance collapses. What once looked charismatic now looks predatory. What once looked confident now looks manipulative. What once sounded like empathy now sounds like mimicry. This creates a natural and unavoidable repulsion, not hatred, not fear. Your nervous system rejects the lack of authenticity the same way the body rejects spoiled food. It's an instinctive, visceral response to something that feels fundamentally wrong. And the more perceptive you become, the more this incompatibility grows. You no longer fit into spaces where masks dominate interactions. You no longer feel comfortable with people who use personas as tools of influence. The false becomes intolerable, the artificial becomes exhausting, and the inauthentic becomes impossible to ignore. This is the price and the power of seeing too clearly. Imagine the overly friendly coworker who insists on touching your shoulder every time he speaks to you. Most people interpret this as warmth or extroversion, but once your perception sharpens, you see the truth beneath the gesture. It's not affectionate, it's a subtle display of dominance. The hand lingers a fraction too long. The touch arrives at moments when you are vulnerable, and the proximity is less about connection and more about testing boundaries. It's a silent way of saying asterisk, I can enter your space whenever I choose. Asterisk, or consider the friend who smiles when you share something painful. Not a soft, empathetic smile, but a quick, bright one, too fast, too sharp, too conveniently timed. At first, you convince yourself it's misunderstanding, but over time, you notice the pattern. Your struggles energize him. Your vulnerability gives him a psychological opening. He's not connecting, he's calculating. The smile isn't empathy, it's opportunity disguised as compassion. And then there is the romantic partner, whose emotional expressions never quite sync with the moment. You cry, and he comforts you with gestures that feel rehearsed, as if he's acting out a script he memorized from observing others. His eyes remain strangely disconnected from the emotion he is showing. His timing is off. His reactions seem copied rather than felt. It becomes clear he isn't experiencing the emotion, he is imitating it, mimicking humanity instead of participating in it. These examples are easy to dismiss until you understand what Machiavelli understood deeply. Strategic behavior often hides behind socially acceptable masks. He called this asterisk strategic staging asterisk, the art of performing just enough humanity to be trusted while concealing one's true intentions. A hand on the shoulder becomes a dominance move. A smile becomes a weapon. A gesture of affection becomes a calculated act. Once you see these patterns for what they are, you stop explaining them away. You stop giving people the benefit of the doubt that they never earned. You start recognizing that not all warmth is benevolent, not all empathy is real, and not all affection is human. Some of it is strategy cold, deliberate, and expertly disguised. Seeing these patterns doesn't come for free. It demands psychological energy more than most people realize. Detecting a predator in human form requires continuous, almost subconscious scanning, the tightening of facial muscles that lasts less than a second, the microshift in eye direction that reveals concealed hostility, the subtle forward lean that mimics friendliness while actually marking territory, the sudden irregularity in breathing when someone pretends to feel an emotion they can't authentically produce. Each of these cues is small on its own, but your mind picks them up and assembles them into a coherent picture that contradicts the mask being presented to you. This constant decoding drains you because it forces your nervous system into a heightened state of awareness. While others take interactions at face value, you are processing layers and tension, posture, micro-expression, tone, pacing, synchrony. It's not paranoia, it's pattern recognition. But recognizing these patterns feels like swimming against a tide of deception. The world is full of people using charm as camouflage, politeness as strategy, and vulnerability as leverage. You're not just observing them, you're filtering, discerning, protecting your psychological boundaries, moment by moment. And this vigilance, though necessary, comes at a cost. It creates a sensation of pushing through an invisible current, an energetic resistance generated by the mismatch between what someone portrays and what they actually feel. When their intention is masked, your body senses the clash before your mind interprets it. You feel the tension as pressure in the chest, a tightening in the gut, a subtle alertness in the shoulders. Your system works harder because it's navigating truth hidden inside layers of performance. In essence, reading these cues is like swimming through a sea of manipulation, silent, constant, and exhausting, not because you're weak, but because you're awake in a world where many operate unconsciously, and some operate with predatory precision. As your perception sharpens and you begin to see beneath the surface of people their motives, their inconsistencies, their subtle manipulations, something inside you naturally shifts. You find yourself craving silence in a way you never did before, not because you dislike people, but because your nervous system becomes finely tuned to the slightest distortion in their behavior. Every forced smile, every strategic compliment, every calculated gesture feels louder, heavier, more intrusive than it once did. Spaces filled with hidden agendas start to drain you. Conversations thick with unspoken intentions feel suffocating. And without making a dramatic decision, you begin withdrawing into environments where the air feels cleaner, where the energy is still, where you can exist without decoding anyone's motives. This movement toward solitude follows a psychological pattern older than society itself, the instinctive retreat of the awakened observer. Jung called it individuation. The mystics called it purification. Machiavelli understood it as a phase of strategic preservation. It is not misanthropy, it is survival. The more accurately you read people, the more impossible it becomes to remain in places polluted by manipulation, envy, or false intimacy. You feel the weight of every inauthentic gesture, every disguised power play, every subtle psychological intrusion, and the quieter your inner world becomes, the more unbearable the noise of the external world feels. So you withdraw not dramatically, not angrily, but intentionally. You choose fewer conversations, fewer social arenas, fewer interactions that force you to dilute your awareness. You prefer solitude, not because you fear others, but because you finally understand yourself. You prefer silence, not because you reject humanity, but because you reject distortion. This phase is a cleansing, a recalibration, a return to psychological neutrality. It allows you to rebuild your energy, restore your clarity, and protect the very sensitivity that gives you insight. It is not an escape. It is a strategic retreat for those who see too much, feel too much, and refuse to let the world dull their perception again. When you retreat from the noise of other people's intentions, something remarkable begins to happen. Your perception doesn't weaken, it sharpens. Solitude becomes a kind of laboratory where your instincts recalibrate, your awareness expands, and the fog of social conditioning finally lifts. Without the constant interference of false warmth, strategic charm, or subtle manipulation, your mind develops a new level of sensitivity. Gestures you once dismissed as meaningless start to speak an entire language of concealed motives. You notice the faint vibration of a finger just before someone delivers a passive-aggressive remark, the tiny pulse of hostility escaping before the mask resets. You catch the smile that appears 1 second to light, a smile that mimics emotion rather than embodies it. You sense the gaze that scans your weaknesses, the way a predator searches for the softest point of entry. This refinement isn't magical, it's psychological. When you remove yourself from environments polluted by hidden agendas, your nervous system finally stops fighting for equilibrium. It becomes free to observe without defending, to perceive without filtering. You become capable of seeing details most people overlook, not because they're blind, but because they're overstimulated, distracted, or too eager to believe in the goodness of every gesture. In solitude, your mind learns to differentiate between genuine connection and calculated performance, between instinct and strategy, between humanity and manipulation. This is the true purpose of withdrawal, transformation, not escape. It is the period where your Machiavellian radar evolves from basic intuition to a precise instrument. You learn to detect intentions in microseconds, to sense deception before it becomes action, to recognize danger before it takes form. Every small signal becomes meaningful. Every delay, every twitch, every false emotional cue becomes part of a map that reveals who someone truly is. In this silence, you don't become colder, you become clearer. You don't become paranoid, you become precise. And when you eventually return to the world, you carry with you a perception so sharpened that no mask can hold steady under your gaze. After this period of sharpening, you don't return to the world as the same person who left it. You re-enter it, altered, quieter on the surface, sharper beneath it. You no longer move through conversations waiting to see what people will do. You already sense it. You don't react to behavior, you anticipate it. The emotional ambushes that once caught you off guard lose their power because you recognize the setup long before the strike. Where others feel threatened by unpredictable people, you now see patterns. Where others feel manipulated by charm, you identify the tactic behind the charm. Fear dissolves, not because the world is safer, but because it has become readable. You become someone who maps the room silently. You notice who tries to dominate through posture, who tries to seduce through mirroring, who tries to control through subtle guilt, who seeks advantage through exaggerated warmth. None of it surprises you anymore. Instead of being drawn into the performance, you observe it from the outside, as though watching a play you've already studied. The predator's mask no longer intimidates you, it amuses you. The false friend's praise no longer flatters you, it informs you. The manipulator's pressure no longer confuses you, it reveals his weaknesses. This is the transformation Machiavelli described in metaphor but understood in essence. The evolution into the invisible prince, the person who governs their interactions without ever appearing to compete. You hold the advantage because you see the dynamics unfolding before they reach the surface. You speak less, listen more, and detect intention before it becomes action. You navigate without announcing your awareness, and this subtlety gives you a kind of untouchable power. People sense something different in you, though they can't define it. They feel they can't manipulate you, but they don't know why. They become cautious, respectful, sometimes even deferential, unaware that what they're responding to is not aggression but clarity. You move through the world without being deceived, without being drained, without being owned by anyone's performance. You govern your space, your energy, your emotional landscape with precision, and to the untrained eye, you remain unnoticed. To the perceptive eye, you become unmistakably sovereign. In the end, the Machiavellian lesson reveals itself with almost brutal simplicity. A psychopath is not dangerous because he deceives, he is dangerous because most people are blind. His power rests entirely on perception, on the collective inability to recognize the small fractures in his performance, the subtle distortions in his emotional timing, the quiet hunger behind his charm. He thrives in a world where people listen to words instead of watching intentions, where they assume sincerity instead of questioning inconsistencies, where they confuse imitation with authenticity. His threat is not his intelligence, but the innocence of those around him. But once you learn to see truly, illusion collapses. The gestures that once looked harmless now read like warnings. The charm that once felt magnetic now feels engineered. The confidence that once impressed you now appears inflated, hollow, desperate to dominate. You begin noticing the micro-pauses before he reacts, the half-second delay before he mirrors emotion, the lack of warmth behind a perfectly timed smile. Nothing he does feels spontaneous anymore, because you can sense the machinery behind the mask. And with that awareness, fear vanishes, not because the psychopath becomes less dangerous, but because he becomes transparent. You recognize the patterns, the tactics, the psychological traps before they're set. He stops being an unpredictable threat and becomes a predictable algorithm. His strategies lose their edge, his manipulations lose their grip, his presence loses its power. This is the great revelation. The moment you learn to read what others ignore, the predator loses his camouflage. He steps into the light without realizing it. You no longer walk through life surrounded by hidden dangers, you walk surrounded by exposed ones. And once the mask is visible to you, it can never be invisible again. The psychopath does not disappear from your world. The illusion that protected him does. From that moment on, he cannot move through your life unnoticed. You have learned to see, and that changes everything. Machiavelli would leave you with a final whisper, something closer to a warning than advice. Those who learn to read gestures inevitably learn to read intentions, and those who can read intentions are no longer governed by others. They become the ones who quietly govern themselves. Power, in his view, was never about domination. It was about perception. The more precisely you see, the less susceptible you are to deception, manipulation, or psychological ambush. Awareness becomes a kind of internal armor, silent but impenetrable. If you have followed this journey until now, you've already begun sharpening that perception. You've started noticing what most people overlook: the slight tension in a smile, the predatory stillness behind a polite gesture, the delayed imitation of emotion. These are not just signals, they are revelations. They are the hidden grammar of human intention, the language beneath every interaction. And once you start understanding that language, the world stops being a maze of unpredictable behaviors and becomes a readable, navigable system. This is why Machiavelli would tell you to continue not out of curiosity, but out of self-preservation. To decode the bodies and behaviors of manipulators is not an intellectual exercise. It is a survival skill in a world full of masks. You don't learn this to judge people. You learn it to protect your clarity, your boundaries, and your psychological sovereignty. So move forward with intention. Let this be the first step in mastering the silent art of unmasking, the discipline of seeing without being seen, of understanding without announcing, of perceiving without reacting. The deeper you go, the fewer threats remain hidden from you, and the fewer threats remain hidden, the more effortlessly you navigate the world. Continue the study. Refine your gaze. Learn the quiet mechanics of human behavior. Because in a world full of performances, the one who sees the truth becomes untouchable.